Hello everyone. For those of you who've forgotten me from week 3 when we dealt with sampling in QES, my name is Sarah Cooper and I'm a researcher based in Cochrane, South Africa at the South African Medical Research Council. My presentation today, I'm going to focus on the topic of typologies, methodologies and epistemologies in QES. So basically, I'm going to be talking about the different approaches to qualitative evidence synthesis. In this very brief presentation, I want to cover kind of two main issues. Firstly, I'm going to introduce some of the common QES approaches. Now, there are many different approaches that can be distinguished along many different dimensions. So in this presentation, I'm going to discuss 3 particular dimensions, which I think are quite fundamental and core, and from which many other differences flow, I think. So these dimensions are the underpinning epistemological position or assumption of an approach, the degree of data transformation, and the role of theory. So to come back to a slide that Lynn showed us in week 1, it explains that qualitative evidence synthesis, or QES, is an umbrella term for the methodologies associated with the systematic review of qualitative research evidence, conducted either standalone or as part of a review of complex interventions and so forth. So what is key here is that QES is really an umbrella term for a range of different methods and methodologies. As with primary qualitative research, there are multiple diverse approaches for QES. And each approach really varies in the level of, for example, its complexity, and also often has very specific in its own set of, for example, principles and methods and processes. And just to say, QES methodologies are still really evolving and changing as we speak. Sometimes I'm amazed at the rate of development of new approaches to QES. So this is just a list of some of the currently existing common approaches found with QES, but there are many others. I think at the moment there are over 40 different QES approaches that currently exist. So, for example, we have an approach called meta-ethnography, meta-study, narrative synthesis, realist synthesis, and so forth. In this slide here, I've devised a kind of a one-liner that characterizes or describes some of the very common kind of QES approaches. One of your prescribed readings for this week by Barnett and Page and Thomas gives a really nice critical overview, I think, of these and various other approaches, which I hope you've had a chance to read. There are also other nice overviews of different QES approaches. For example, one by Gao and colleagues and Dixon Woods and colleagues, which I've put in your recommending reading list. So you can really look at those to see all the different kind of approaches that exist for QES. So here I've just named a few. So for example, meta-ethnography, and this approach really tries to bring together separate findings into an interpretive explanation that is greater than the sum of the parts. We have another approach, for example, called critical interpretive synthesis. So here it critically approaches the literature in terms of deconstructing research traditions or theoretical assumptions. So this approach is really about looking critically and problematizing, if you like, the literature. We have thematic analysis, which is probably you might have heard of, a very common one, and this really is focusing on identifying major or recurrent themes in the data and summarizes these findings under these themes. So kind of summary of findings. We have an approach called best of fit framework, and here this really is about testing and building on an existing conceptual model or theory conceived for potentially different but relevant population or context. We have another approach called meta-study. This can be seen as quite similar to a critical interpretive synthesis. And here it's also about problematizing the literature. So it interrogates the theoretical and methodological assumptions underpinning included studies and the wider context in which theory is generated. And then finally, I've just picked these quite randomly. We have an approach called realist synthesis. So this explores how interventions work, under what conditions, and for whom to identify, test, and refine hypotheses on causal mechanisms. So these are just some of the many different approaches, and I hope from your reading you've got a feel for some of these approaches. What I really want to focus on with this presentation is kind of to think about how we might distinguish different QES approaches. And they can be distinguished along a number of different dimensions. So for example, they may ask or be suited to different kind of questions. Different approaches often have different perspectives on the methods for sampling, for example, or critical appraisal. And then different approaches may also have very different kind of ways of approaching data analysis and extraction. And then many other dimensions with which we could kind of differentiate or distinguish different approaches. In this presentation, I'd like to highlight three particular dimensions. And for me, these three dimensions are really quite fundamental or core differences that I think are important to grasp in terms of QES, and also from which, if you understand these differences, many other kind of differences often flow and make sense. So these dimensions are the underpinning epistemological position or assumptions of an approach, the degree of data transformation, and the role of theory within an approach. So the first dimension on which we could distinguish different QES approaches is what can be thought of as the underpinning epistemological assumptions or epistemological position. So quite a fancy word that some of you might feel intimidated by, but really simply epistemology is a branch of philosophy that's concerned with theories of knowledge. So it's really concerned with ideas about what is knowledge. How do we think knowledge is acquired? How do we know what we know? What methods for gathering knowledge are valid, and so forth. So it's really theories of how we understand knowledge and how it is acquired. So on the one end of the spectrum, we have what might be referred to as a kind of subjective idealism epistemological position. And this is really based on an idea that there's no shared reality independent of multiple alternative human constructions. So this kind of perspective takes a highly constructivist kind of view of knowledge, the kind of idea that all knowledge is socially constructed. On the far other end of the spectrum, we have a position that could be understood as kind of naive realism. So here, the view that reality exists independently of human constructions and that it can be known directly. So this kind of approach, which for those of you that are more quantitative researchers, this kind of position could be seen as what a lot of quantitative research assumes. So it assumes a kind of unproblematized direct window onto the world view. So here the kind of idea that there's, if you like, a sort of stable and common truth about the world that is out there and which we can discover and we can represent. So different QES methodologies lie along the spectrum of epistemological positions. So for example, approaches that you may have come across by now, meta-narrative, critical interpretive synthesis, and meta-study, these approaches tend to be on the more subjective idealist approach to knowledge. So they kind of tend to assume that there's no single one objective reality, and so they tend to avoid kind of grand theories, overarching theories about phenomena. So rather, these approaches tend to be concerned with kind of examining the variation and complexity of different conceptualizations. In direct contrast, a methodology such as one that you may have come across now in your reading, such as meta-aggregation, this can be thought of as lying on the realist side of the spectrum. So it tends to assume that the synthesized findings it produces are reproducible and depict a kind of shared or common reality that is out there. Obviously, pigeonhole these different QES approaches into specific epistemological positions is a problem, as things are often a lot more blurred here and less clear in this way. And sometimes also one particular approach can hold different epistemological underpinnings depending on how the researcher uses it or conceptualizes the approach. So things are not as clear-cut as maybe this table from Barnett and Page depicts. But I think contrasting QESs along kind of their broad epistemological ideas can be helpful and useful for thinking about different approaches and their kind of similarities and differences. A second very related dimension on which QES approaches can be differentiated is what can be thought of as their degree of data transformation. So here we need to sort of understand that qualitative research findings, including QES findings, but also findings from primary research, can be thought of as located along a kind of spectrum based on the degree of abstraction of analysis, or what is referred to as data transformation. So at one end of the spectrum are more kind of what can be thought of as like descriptive findings. So these findings really just depict or describe patterns in the data. On the far end of the spectrum are more interpretive or explanatory findings. These are very transformed findings that have a very high level of kind of abstraction, and they tend to provide kind of theoretical interpretations or explanations. So they don't just describe, they provide kind of interpretations of patterns in the data. So to make this a little bit more tangible to understand, these are two examples of findings. They're taken from primary qualitative studies. So the study on the left, it was a study conducted by Siegel and colleagues that aimed to understand HIV-infected women's reasons for wanting to have a child. And a key finding was that, and I quote, so the finding was, women reported 3 major reasons for wanting a child. Number 1, her husband, boyfriend really wants a child. Number 2, having missed out on raising her children. And 3, believing that a child would make her feel complete, fulfilled, or happy. So this is, I think, a very good example of what can be thought of as a more descriptive finding with very little data transformation. So I hope you can see it's really describing patterns in the data. In contrast, the study on the right, which explored experiences of a group of women who are HIV positive and are also white, heterosexual, and middle class. And here a key study finding, and again I'm quoting, the finding was, symbolic capital translates into social power and allows these women to control disclosure of their HIV status. Ironically, attempts to protect their moral status helps to reproduce dominant social and cultural constructions that continue to link AIDS with risk groups. So I hope it's obviously clear that this finding is really an example of an interpretative kind of finding. So here it doesn't just describe what the data said or the patterns, but really attempts to provide a kind of interpretive or theoretical explanation of the patterns in the data. And this kind of finding we can think of has a kind of high level of data transformation or abstraction. So I hope these examples kind of give you even at least just a feel for how qualitative findings can be quite different in their level of transformation. So in the context of a QES, more kind of aggregative QES approaches involve review authors adding up or kind of summarizing the data from primary studies. And here they can be thought of, they're producing really quite descriptive level findings where there's very little transformation of the data. In direct contrast, more kind of interpretive QES approaches involve authors rearranging and interpreting or kind of configuring the data from primary studies. And this is done to develop concepts for interpreting and understanding phenomena. And here the data from the primary studies really undergoes a lot of transformation and interpretation. So that's a kind of second way of distinguishing different QES approaches from each other. A final, again very related dimension on which QES approaches can be differentiated is the role that theory plays. And here a distinction can be made between approaches that focus more on kind of testing theory and those that are focused more on exploring or generating theory. So some QES approaches can be thought of that are closer to systematic reviews of effectiveness, and here they're really concerned with testing a theory and maybe also developing hypotheses about potential relations or effects. These methodologies can be thought of as a lot more kind of deductive in their approach. So that is like the key concepts or conceptual frameworks are defined at an early stage in the review, often at the start, and it's used to organize and explain the data from empirical studies. And here the kind of theoretical work takes place predominantly before and after the synthesis, rather than kind of during. And here the role of theory is really to frame the review question or to apply and understand the findings. In contrast, other QES approaches are more concerned with exploring or developing new theory and conceptual understanding. So these kind of methodologies can be thought of as more inductive in their approach. So that is, the review authors don't start off with kind of predefined concepts or predefined conceptual framework. So rather these concepts and frameworks develop through the interpretive analysis. So in contrast to the other kind of approach, here the theoretical work kind of takes place during the analysis to really build theory and meaning and interpretation. So in summary, taking these three together, the epistemological position of a QES approach, its degree of data transformation, and the role of theory, the role that theory plays, are three kind of interrelated dimensions on which QES approaches can be understood and differentiated from each other. And as I've said previously, really grasping, and they can be hard concepts to grasp, I think are important and help one to then kind of understand what is at the heart of differences between different QES approaches. So I encourage you to kind of really grasp these concepts. So this figure was developed by Go and colleagues, which is in your, I think it's prescribed, your recommended reading. And here they attempt to put these and other dimensions together, so kind of looking at how they might be linked together, the different kind of concepts. Again, it might be somewhat of a kind of oversimplification of things, as in reality, kind of QES approaches are a lot more blurred and overlapping and not so easy to kind of put in these clear distinctions. But I think this approach helps one to kind of understand the relationship between different distinctions and how things often come together within a particular approach. So those QESs QES approaches, that have a more kind of constructivist or idealist epistemological stance, these approaches often take a more configurative or interpretive approach to the synthesis. And at the same time, this links, they often usually focused on generating or exploring theory. And with these kind of approaches, the specific methods are often adapted and selected more iteratively as the research proceeds. So the methods kind of move a lot more back and forth. In contrast, QES approaches that have a more kind of realist epistemological stance are often more aggregative or summative in their kind of approach. And these kind of methodologies are often more focused on testing theory. These kind of approaches often have methods that are predefined and unfold in what can be thought of as kind of quite a linear fashion during the review. So, for example, they'll have quite a clearly specified question at the start of the review, and the search strategies and sampling approaches are quite fixed and predetermined. Gao and colleagues also see the use of these kind of review findings as flowing from these differences. So they suggest kind of interpretive approaches are more used for understanding or enlightenment kind of purposes, whereas more aggregative approaches are kind of, you could think of them as more instrumental or policy relevant usages. But I'm actually not so sure whether I necessarily agree with this, and my experience with kind of more interpretive approaches, I think, can also have very instrumental kind of usages. But we can talk about this more if you would like at our contact session on Thursday. So I hope this very brief presentation has provided some kind of insights into different QES approaches, and particularly how we might think about distinguishing them. I look forward to seeing you all again in some more discussion, maybe unpacking some of these approaches more at our contact session on Thursday. I would just like to acknowledge Claire Glenton and Karen Daniels, whose presentations informed some of the content and images of my presentation. Thank you, everyone. Siyabonga, Danki, Inkosi. See you Thursday.